From battlefield blunders that cost thousands of lives, to political miscalculations that nearly changed the course of the war, America's road to victory in World War II was anything but flawless. These are the 11 worst American military blunders of World War II, where power met pride and victory came at a price. Number 11. Ignoring early warnings before the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. December 7th, 1941, was the morning that changed everything. With more than 2,400 Americans killed as Japanese planes roared across the skies of Oahu, striking Pearl Harbor with precision and fury. It was this attack that forced the United States into World War II. And yet, it was an attack that many signs had already whispered was coming their way. In the summer of 1940, the U.S. intelligence had managed to crack a Japanese diplomatic code known as Purple, offering rare glimpses into Tokyo's foreign policy, but what they didn't know would prove fatal. Japan's army, navy, and diplomats all used entirely different code systems, and the military's versions remained shrouded in mystery. Messages took hours, sometimes days, to decrypt, translate, and interpret, by which time crucial clues had already gone cold. As Japan's fleet sailed under strict radio silence, the Americans saw only fragments, hints that never quite fit the full picture. Analysts in Washington and Hawaii worked feverishly, but the Imperial Navy's last-minute code changes left them blind. The final mistake wasn't just technical, it was psychological. Commanders couldn't imagine that Japan would dare strike first, let alone at a heavily fortified American base. That disbelief, born from arrogance and complacency, turned deadly. When the sun rose over Pearl Harbor, it didn't just expose smoke and wreckage. It also revealed one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in U.S. history, and a brutal lesson in the cost of underestimation. Number 10. Underestimating Japanese forces in the Philippines. When General Douglas MacArthur returned to duty in 1941, he carried more than medals and pride, because he also carried the illusion that America's presence in the Pacific was untouchable. Under War Plan Orange 3, the U.S. strategy was clear: to defend the entrance to Manila Bay, hold the Patton Peninsula at all costs, and deny Japan any foothold in the islands. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it was a fantasy. The plan assumed a one-on-one conflict with Japan, not a world already consumed by global war. American troops were undertrained, supplies were scarce, and the Air Force was all but outdated. Yet MacArthur's confidence soared higher than his planes. He dismissed warnings of Japan's rapid expansion across Asia, convinced that U.S. firepower alone would keep the enemy at bay. But when Japan struck, fast, coordinated, and merciless, all the confidence collapsed. Within hours, airfields were reduced to ash. Within weeks, defenses crumbled. MacArthur's forces retreated to Patton and Corregidor, fighting on dwindling food, ammunition, and hope. By April 1942, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the war, the Bataan Death March, where prisoners were forced to march over 60 miles under brutal conditions, thousands dying along the way. MacArthur escaped, vowing to return, but the cost of his overconfidence was already written in blood. A stark reminder that arrogance can be deadlier than any enemy. Number 9. Battle of Kasserine Pass. By early 1943, American forces entered North Africa with confidence, maybe too much of it. Kasserine Pass would be their first major test against the German army, and unfortunately, pride would meet reality in the harshest way possible. U.S. commanders believed the rugged Tunisian mountains were virtually impossible for tanks to cross. Rommel, also nicknamed the Desert Fox, being one of the most famous generals of Germany, proved them wrong within hours. American troops, still green and untested, were deployed in scattered pockets across the terrain, positioned too far apart to support one another. When German armor punched through those gaps, the U.S. line shattered like glass under pressure. Communications failed, units retreated without orders, and confusion rippled across the battlefield. Leadership only made things worse. Commanders clung to flawed assumptions, underestimated German mobility, and hesitated at the worst possible moments. The result was chaos, a torrent of German firepower pouring through the pass, overwhelming American defenses and sending them into a disorganized retreat. But buried in that humiliation was a brutal but necessary lesson. Kasserine showed the U.S. Army that bravery wasn't enough. They needed coordination, discipline, and mastery of combined arms warfare if they hoped to stand against the Axis. And from that disaster, reforms began. New leadership, tighter strategies, and a far more serious understanding of the enemy. Yet this wouldn't be the last time hesitation and miscalculation would trap American forces, because a far bloodier stalemate was waiting across the sea, at a place called Anzio. Number 8. The Anzio Stalemate. Operation Shingle was supposed to be bold, a surprise landing behind German lines that would crack open the Italian front and send Allied forces racing toward Rome. Instead, it became one of World War II's most painful examples of hesitation turning into disaster. On January 22, 1944, U.S. troops landed at Anzio with almost no resistance. The path inland was wide open. The element of surprise was theirs, and then nothing happened. Major General John Lucas, fearing a trap, chose caution over momentum. He fortified the beachhead instead of striking forward. That pause, just a few critical hours, was all the Germans needed. Reinforcements poured in and artillery zeroed in. Within days, the Allies were surrounded, pinned down, and forced into a nightmare of trench warfare that felt more like World War I than World War II. For 4 brutal months, the beachhead was hammered by constant shelling, sniper fire, and counterattacks. Thousands of Americans were killed or wounded as the operation devolved into a static, bloody stalemate. The promise of a swift breakthrough had turned into a grueling siege. It wasn't until new leadership arrived, Major General Lucien K. Truscott, Jr., that the tide finally shifted. Under his aggressive command, U.S. forces broke through the German lines and captured Rome. But victory came with a haunting question. Yes, they did take over the city, but was it worth the rivers of blood spilled in those beaches? Number 7. Operation Market Garden. The bloodshed at Anzio showed how caution could paralyze an army. But months later, the Allies swung to the opposite extreme. Not too little ambition, but far too much. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden was launched with one dream: to end the war by Christmas. It was daring, cinematic, and dangerously optimistic. The plan was split in two. Market, a massive airborne assault involving thousands of U.S. paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and Garden, a ground offensive racing up a narrow Dutch highway. Together, they would seize a chain of bridges leading straight into Germany. But war doesn't bend to ambition, it breaks it. Flawed intelligence underestimated German strength in the region, including armored units regrouping far faster than anyone expected. Bad weather scattered the airborne drops, leaving units isolated and exposed. And the final objective, the bridge at Arnhem, never fell. The British 1st Airborne Division was cut off and overwhelmed, turning the mission into a desperate fight for survival. U.S. paratroopers fought fiercely, securing several bridges but unable to hold the entire route alone. The corridor collapsed under German counterattacks, supply lines broke, and the dream of ending the war early evaporated. By the end, thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. The Allies had reached for victory with both hands and came up short. It became the defining symbol of strategic overreach, a bridge too far. And yet, the cost of ambition was far from the last mistake of 1944. Because what laid ahead was a forest so dark, so brutal, it would become synonymous with disaster. Number 6. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. From September to December 1944, American forces pushed into the Hürtgen Forest, a shadow-choked maze of ridges, ravines, and heavy fires just beyond the Belgian border. Instead of a quick operation, the U.S. Army found itself trapped in a 3-month ordeal. More than 33,000 soldiers, nearly 1 in every 4, became casualties, not only from German fire, but also from the forest itself. The terrain turned every step into a gamble. Artillery shells detonated in the treetops, creating deadly tree bursts that showered soldiers with splinters sharper than shrapnel. Small arms fire echoed unpredictably through the woods. Defenders were well fortified and supply lines constantly faltered. Thousands more troops fell to non-combat injuries like trench foot, frostbite, pneumonia, and psychological trauma from the relentless claustrophobic fighting. Overshadowed later by the Battle of the Bulge, Hürtgen remains the longest battle the American Army has ever fought, and one of its most criticized. Historian Carlo D'Este called it the most ineptly fought series of battles of the war in the West, a judgment echoed by many who survived its brutal conditions. In the end, the Hürtgen Forest didn't reshape the front lines or cripple the German army. It only revealed the high price of misjudgment, showing how a poorly chosen battlefield could become a commander's worst enemy. Number 5. The Sherman tank problem. The Sherman entered World War II as America's workhorse tank, designed for speed, mobility, and mass production. But all those strengths came with a price. Its 75mm gun struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of German heavy tanks, forcing American crews to flank just to have a fighting chance. Meanwhile, German guns, the deadly 88s mounted on Tigers, could destroy a Sherman from far beyond the range of its own weapon. The problems didn't end there. The Sherman's tall profile and high center of gravity turned it into an easy target. And once its armor was pierced, the tank had a notorious tendency to burst into flames as ammunition cooked off, so common that crews grimly nicknamed it the Ronson, after the lighter. Lights every time. What makes the story frustrating is that the flaws were known. American officials understood the Sherman was outclassed, but prioritized production numbers, political optics, and logistical simplicity over battlefield survival. By the time improved variants arrived, thousands of U.S. tankers had already paid the price. The Sherman wasn't a bad tank in itself, but it was the wrong tank for the enemies it faced in 1944. And its story remains one of World War II's sharpest reminders that overwhelming numbers can't always compensate for a flawed design. Number 4. Battle of the Bulge. And if the Sherman problem showed how flawed equipment could tip the scales, the next disaster proved something even worse: that a war can be lost long before the first shot is fired, if intelligence refuses to see the truth. The German offensive Untermenwacht am Rhein launched in 16th December 1944. It was Hitler's last gamble on the Western Front, a desperate attempt to seize Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. American forces, stretched, tired, and convinced the war was nearly won, found themselves crushed by the opening blow. At first, the Germans swept forward with terrifying speed, exploiting the forested terrain and the element of total surprise. Roads jammed, units collapsed, and entire divisions were nearly overrun. It was a disaster born not of weakness, but of blindness. The Allies had all the clues, yet clung to the belief that Germany simply couldn't attack. But when the shock faded, the fight hardened. U.S. soldiers dug in against the freezing cold and relentless artillery. The stand at Bastion became legendary, and General Patton's Third Army executed a rapid northward pivot that military planners still study today. Inch by inch, mile by mile, the Bulge was crushed back. The U.S. ultimately won, but at a staggering cost. Tens of thousands killed, wounded, or missing. Nearly 20,000 frostbite cases alone, and a brutal reminder that the enemy you underestimate is always the one who strikes the hardest. Number 3. The fight within. The next mistake showed an uglier side, because sometimes the enemy isn't across the battlefield. Sometimes he's standing beside you, fighting from the same side. Two of the Allies' most celebrated commanders, America's General George S. Patton, Jr. and Britain's Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, spent as much energy competing with each other as they did fighting the Germans. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, as it seeped into strategy, communications, and operations across Europe. Every hour they wasted chasing personal glory meant slower advances, confused orders, and soldiers bleeding for decisions shaped more by ego than necessity. Patton was bold, aggressive, and obsessed with speed, a commander who believed war rewarded momentum. Montgomery, precise and cautious, preferred methodical attacks and perfect planning. Both were brilliant, both were infuriating, and both wanted to be the hero of the war campaign. What followed was a political and strategic tug-of-war, which included competing plans for how to push into Germany, public boasts that irritated the other side, leaked comments to newspapers, and field decisions shaped as much by rivalry as by military logic. Their feud never stopped the war effort, but it certainly didn't help it. Because victory required unity, yet two of its most important generals often acted like they were fighting for headlines instead of homeland. Number 2. General Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur, brilliant, theatrical, and fiercely self-assured, often let ambition steer strategy. From the Philippines to later island operations, his decisions repeatedly stretched American forces to the breaking point. MacArthur's judgment was not just a military factor. Instead, it was a political force. And when that force went unchecked, the results were devastating, with unnecessary casualties, fractured U.S.-Australian relations, and a trail of battles that suffered because one man believed he could not be wrong. His first and most costly mistake came immediately after Pearl Harbor. Even after being warned that Japan might strike next, MacArthur hesitated. Instead of launching a counterattack on Japanese bases in Formosa, he delayed and paid the price. When Japanese bombers hit Clark Field, American aircraft were still on the ground refueling. In minutes, 12 of 17 heavy bombers were destroyed. The rest were crippled. Air power in the Philippines evaporated before the ground war even began. That failure cascaded into a broader disaster. His mishandling of the Philippines' defense, including confused orders, outdated plans, and an inability to adapt, led to a collapse that might have been avoided. Soldiers fought bravely, but they were fighting inside a strategy warped by overconfidence. And later, in the island-hopping campaigns, MacArthur continued to push bold, high-risk advances that strained supply lines and forced allies to compensate for his ambitions. MacArthur won many headlines, but the Pacific had paid the price. Number 1. The firebombing of civilian cities in Japan. The final American blunder of the war revealed its real face on how the greed of victory itself can blur the lines between war and revenge. By 1945, U.S. bombing strategy had shifted from precision strikes to total destruction. Instead of targeting factories, bases, or supply lines, American planners turned their sights on the heart of Japanese cities, where civilians lived, worked, and slept. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe all became targets of incendiary raids, designed not just to weaken Japan's war machine, but to burn entire urban regions to ash. It was militarily effective, strategically impactful, but morally catastrophic. The most infamous raid came on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. A fleet of 279 B-29 superfortresses dropped waves of incendiary bombs across Tokyo, igniting firestorms that devoured entire neighborhoods. 15 square miles of the capital vanished in flames. Over 90,000 civilians died, perhaps more than 100,000 in a single night, with 1 million people left homeless, and Tokyo was only the beginning. Throughout the spring and summer, U.S. forces firebombed dozens of Japanese cities. These conventional attacks, instead of the atomic bombs, caused the highest civilian death toll of the entire Pacific War. Entire communities burned before Japan ever saw Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Supporters argued that the raids shortened the war. Critics saw them as vengeance disguised as strategy. But one thing is undeniable, that the line between defeating an enemy and destroying a people had never been thinner. In the closing chapter of World War II, America achieved its objective, but the moral cost still haunts history. These 11 blunders show a side of World War II that history books often gloss over: the mistakes, misjudgments, and miscalculations that cost lives and shaped the war just as much as victories. So, which of these mistakes shocked you the most, and which one do you think changed the course of history the hardest? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the hidden side of history that actually made the world what it is today.